This is a time apart for us to be better.
It is disappointing that the National Party has decided today to leave the coalition.
The Nationals didn't want cabinet solidarity, meaning that they could cross the floor.
I wasn't confident that shadow cabinet solidarity would be maintained going forward.
That was not part of our consideration.
We've just received a note from Sussan Ley's office saying it is not correct to suggest that shadow cabinet solidarity was not a sticking point.
If there was ever a bunch of politicians who seemed determined to prove that voters got it right at the last election, it must be members of the federal coalition, in particular the National Party. The lack of policy work in the coalition was exposed during the election campaign. Former leader Peter Dutton copped much of the blame for that. But in his absence, the rump that is his legacy, the much diminished numbers of MPs and senators, have revealed how they are apparently incapable of even running their own internal relationships.
I had a brief meeting with Sussan Ley, and she made an offer to reconvene her party room to discuss the 4 policy areas that the National Party demand as part of a coalition agreement.
Do you concede that you've jumped the gun on this?
No, I was working by the process and the timelines that were given to us by the Liberal Party.
The coalition soap opera has seemed to be a lot about self-interest and not a lot about national interest. The Nationals might say the policy sticking points reflect what their voters wanted, but they don't seem to reflect what the majority of voters seem to have said. And the brawling has drowned out issues of much more direct importance to voters. This week's Reserve Bank decision to cut interest rates marks an important pivot point in the economy and for the opportunities that gives a government which the coalition seems determined to ensure will be in place for the next 6 years.
When inflation is low and stable and people can get jobs, it's good for households, it's good for communities and it's good for the broader Australian economy. So the cautious approach we have taken has got us to this point where inflation is now below 3% and employment is holding up.
This is the first time since records began that we've got the unemployment rate in the low 4s at the same time as we've got both measures of inflation in the target band.
So what we're seeing now is a pivot from managing the cycle with things like inflation to dealing with the structural issues of the economy.
The backdrop to the first term of the Albanese government was a global inflation shock, which hit almost every aspect of the cost of living. This week's rate cut decision was an effective declaration that that shock has now largely passed. The economic challenges now are different, centred on the global uncertainty created by Donald Trump, which most economists believe will mean lower growth but contained inflation for economies like ours. In this world, the political debate will now focus on how changes the government introduced in its last term will now start to flow through in areas like housing.
The federal government and the states and territories are unified in having a goal to construct more houses in Australia. There's now finance that's been put aside by state and federal governments, and now it's a question of implementing. What we have to do is to make sure that we reform our planning approval processes so they're quicker.
Direct government spending on housing, which was delayed in the Senate, will start to flow in coming months. And in the private building sector, a perfect storm of roadblocks, from high interest rates to supply chain issues, is also clearing. The apparent sidelining of the coalition for the next 6 years means the government now also has a chance to bed down energy reform, with investors feeling more certain about the outlook.
Investors in clean energy are really looking for long-term certainty. They're investing large amounts of money in assets that operate over 10, 20, 30-year lifetimes. And so the more certainty, the better. And I think, clearly the outcome from the recent federal election gives continuity of policy and gives some certainty. I think very clearly the mandate that was provided for the clean energy transition also gives comfort to investors that we're in for the long haul.
There are plenty of challenging issues to be resolved, from gas supply to environmental approvals to a new emissions reduction target. But changing economic circumstances and very different political ones means it will be a very different debate in Canberra in the next 3 years.
There's nothing easy about governing, and we don't underestimate our political opponents even at their worst, but our focus is not on our opposition. Our focus is on our economy. It's on the challenges of the next 3 years and the decades beyond. Our focus will continue to be on providing the responsible economic management It was the primary focus in our first term and during the campaign, and it will be a primary focus in our second term as well.